June 6, 1944, 0558 hours. Widerstands Nest 62, a concrete bunker perched on the bluffs overlooking what the Allies would later call Omaha Beach. Major Werner Pluskat, of the 352nd Infantry Division, pressed his field glasses against his eyes so hard that his hands trembled. The grey pre-dawn light had just begun to reveal what his radar operators had been telling him for the past hour, but what his mind had refused to accept. The English Channel, which had been empty and dark when he'd last checked at 0400 hours, was no longer a channel at all. It was a parking lot, a metallic forest, an impossibility made manifest. Ships, thousands upon thousands of ships, stretching from horizon to horizon in every direction he turned his gaze. Battleships with guns, the size of railway tunnels. Cruisers bristling with weaponry. Destroyers cutting white foam trails through the grey water. And behind them, in formations so dense they seemed to merge into a single dark mass, were the transport's fat, ungainly vessels pregnant with men and machines, and the sheer industrial weight of a civilization that had decided to cross an ocean and end a war. Pluskat's adjutant, Lieutenant Wilkening, stood beside him in the bunker, his own binoculars trained on the armada. Neither man spoke for a full minute. Finally, Wilkening lowered his glasses and turned to his commander with a face drained of all color. "Herr Major," he whispered, "there must be 10,000 ships out there." Pluskat didn't correct him. He couldn't. The number didn't matter anymore. Whether it was 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 made no practical difference to what was about to happen. He lifted the field telephone to call his regimental headquarters, but his hand froze halfway to his ear. What words could possibly convey what he was witnessing? How do you describe the end of the world? What Major Pluskat could not have known, as he stood in that concrete tomb watching the greatest armada in human history materialize from the morning mist, was that he wasn't witnessing a battle. He was witnessing a mathematical certainty. This wasn't D-Day as popular imagination would later paint it. A desperate gamble, a close-run thing, a narrow Allied victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. This was an execution, a demonstration. The final, crushing proof that the Second World War had been decided not by ideology or courage or tactical brilliance, but by something far more prosaic and far more devastating: industrial capacity. The ships Pluskat saw represented more than military force. They represented the complete and total annihilation of any mathematical possibility that Germany could win this war. They were the physical manifestation of an economic reality that German high command had been desperately trying to ignore for years. The Wehrmacht wasn't about to be defeated by soldiers on a beach. It was about to be buried under an avalanche of steel, rubber, concrete, petroleum, and the incomprehensible productive capacity of nations that could outbuild Germany at a rate so staggering that the numbers themselves become weapons of psychological warfare. The actual count, meticulously documented by Allied naval historians in the months following the invasion, would reveal that Operation Neptune, the naval component of Operation Overlord, assembled 6,939 vessels for the Normandy landings. Not the 10,000 that Wilkening guessed in his shock, but close enough that the distinction was academic. These weren't just ships. They were a taxonomy of military-industrial complexity that Germany could no longer match. There were 1,213 warships providing naval gunfire support, including 7 battleships that displaced more tonnage than some nations' entire fleets. The USS Nevada alone, which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor and raised, repaired, and sailed across 2 oceans to arrive at Normandy, mounted 10 14-inch guns that could hurl a 1,500-pound shell 20 miles inland, with enough explosive force to vaporize a German bunker and everyone inside it. Multiply that firepower by 7 battleships. Then add 23 cruisers, each carrying between 6 and 15 guns, ranging from 6 to 8 inches. Then add 105 destroyers, 71 corvettes, and hundreds of smaller patrol craft, minesweepers, and subchasers. Every single one of these vessels had been built, armed, fueled, crewed, trained, and sailed across the Atlantic itself, a logistical miracle that would have been impossible without the destruction of the German U-boat fleet, which had lost 237 submarines in the previous 12 months alone. But the warships were merely the shield. Behind them came the sword. 4,126 landing ships and landing craft of every conceivable design. LSTs, landing ship, tank each capable of beaching itself, dropping its bow ramp, and disgorging 20 Sherman tanks, or 30 trucks, or 200 tons of ammunition, or any combination thereof directly onto a hostile shore. LCIs, landing craft, infantry, each carrying 200 men who would wade into surf that was about to be transformed into an industrial-scale meat grinder. LCTs, landing craft, tanks smaller, faster, more expendable, built by the hundreds in British and American shipyards that had been retooled to produce vessels at a rate of completion that would have seemed like science fiction to the naval architects of 1939. The Allies had built 1,051 LSTs alone during the war. Germany, by comparison, never fielded a single purpose-built amphibious landing ship. Not one. The entire concept of an opposed amphibious landing on the scale of Normandy was so foreign to German military planning, so far beyond their industrial capability, that they had no vessels designed for it, no doctrine to counter it, and no mathematical framework to even comprehend the logistical pyramid required to sustain it. And then there were the 736 ancillary vessels, repair ships, hospital ships, salvage vessels, tugs, barrage balloon ships, and the 2 Mulberry Harbour's artificial floating ports, each the size of Dover, that would be towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches to provide deep-water docking facilities, because the Allies assumed, correctly, that they would not be able to capture an intact port for weeks. The Germans had spent years fortifying every major port from Norway to Spain, transforming them into fortresses bristled with concrete, steel, and mines. The Allies looked at this situation, calculated that taking a fortified port would cost too much time and too many lives, and simply decided to bring their own ports with them. This wasn't tactics. This was a nation, 3 nations, really, America, Britain, and Canada, that possessed such overwhelming industrial surplus that they could afford to construct 2 complete artificial harbors, each consisting of 400 individual units weighing 1.5 million tons combined, tow them across one of the world's most treacherous bodies of water, and plant them on a hostile shore as casually as a farmer erecting a fence. Major Pluskat, watching from his bunker as the sky began to lighten, saw the ships, but he couldn't see what they represented. He couldn't see the 138 factories across the American Midwest that had been retooled to produce nothing but landing craft components. He couldn't see the shipyards in Belfast, Glasgow, Newcastle, and 24 American ports where vessels were being launched at a rate of 3 per day launched, not begun 3 complete ocean-going vessels rolling down slipways every single day for years. He couldn't calculate that the 6,939 ships he was witnessing represented approximately 20 million tons of steel, or that this steel was merely a tiny fraction of the 85 million tons of steel the United States alone would produce in 1944. Germany's entire steel production for 1,944 would total 28 million tons, and most of that would go to replacing tanks, aircraft, and submarines that were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The Americans were producing steel at triple Germany's rate and using it to build ships that would deliver tanks that were themselves being produced at a rate that made German tank production look like a boutique custom automotive shop. The sky above the armada was no longer grey. It was turning into something else entirely, a metallic canopy of aircraft flying in formations so dense and so numerous that they blotted out the dawn. Pluskat heard them before he saw them clearly. A sustained, apocalyptic thunder that started as a distant rumble and built to a physical pressure against his eardrums, a mechanical roar so loud and so continuous that it became impossible to distinguish individual engines. The roar wasn't coming from a squadron or even a wing. It was coming from an air force, multiple air forces that had achieved something historians would later call air supremacy, but which Pluskat experienced simply as the death of the sky itself, as a neutral space. There were 11,590 Allied aircraft committed to Operation Overlord. On D-Day itself, they would fly 14,674 sorties individual aircraft missions in 24 hours. For perspective, that's an aircraft taking off or landing every 5.9 seconds, sustained for an entire day, across dozens of airfields in England. These weren't observation planes or transport aircraft hastily pressed into service. These were purpose-built weapon systems produced by an aviation industry that had undergone a transformation so total and so rapid that it defied comprehension. Boeing B-17. Flying Fortresses, four-engine heavy bombers capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of high explosives, had been produced at a rate of 16 per day at peak production. The B-24 Liberator, an even larger bomber, was built faster. 18 per day from the Willow Run factory alone, a facility constructed specifically to build bombers and nothing else, where a finished B-24 rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. These bombers were now overhead, flying in box formations designed to saturate German defenses with such overwhelming firepower that individual anti-aircraft guns became statistically irrelevant. A single German 88mm flak gun might shoot down one, perhaps two bombers before being destroyed by the concentrated defensive fire of 50 waist gunners and ball turret gunners. The mathematics of attrition didn't favor the defenders. Escorting these bombers were 5,409 fighter aircraft, P-50, 1 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, Spitfires, Typhoons, and Lightnings. The P-51, in particular, represented a technological and industrial achievement that had fundamentally altered the character of the air war. With drop tanks extending their range to 1,650 miles, these fighters could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have fuel for combat. More critically, they were being produced at a rate of 15,000 per year, more than the entire Luftwaffe's fighter production for 1,944. Germany would build approximately 25,000 fighters of all types in 1944, a number that seems impressive until you realize that the United States alone produced 38,000 fighters that same year, while simultaneously producing 16,000 bombers, 8,000 transport aircraft, and training 250,000 pilots. The Luftwaffe had trained 15,000 pilots in 1944 and was losing them faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages meant that new German pilots were entering combat with perhaps 50 hours of flight training. Their American counterparts had 400 hours before they ever saw combat, and they were flying aircraft that had been manufactured with such consistency and quality control that mechanical failure was becoming statistically rare. Werner Pluskat could see perhaps 24 aircraft at any given moment through the narrow vision slit of his bunker. He couldn't see the entire tactical picture. The photo reconnaissance Spitfires that had been photographing every square meter of the Normandy coast for months, producing images so detailed that Allied planners knew the location of individual German machine gun nests. He couldn't see the radar-jamming aircraft, 17 squadrons of them that were filling German radar screens with false echoes and chaff, creating phantom invasion fleets heading toward the Pas de Calais, while the real invasion unfolded at Normandy. He couldn't see the C-47 transport planes that had just finished dropping 13,100 American paratroopers and 7,900 British paratroopers behind German lines, or the 517 gliders that had crash-landed in the pre-dawn darkness carrying jeeps, anti-tank guns, and the psychological shock of enemy soldiers materializing kilometers behind the coastal defenses. What he could see, with horrible clarity, were the first waves of landing craft detaching from their motherships and beginning their run toward the beach. They came in waves, literally and organizationally. The first wave consisted of amphibious Sherman tanks, DD tanks, or duplex drive tanks, which could swim through the surf with inflatable canvas screens, keeping them buoyant. 32 were launched toward Omaha Beach. 27 sank in the rough seas, drowning their crews. But 5 made it. And even these 5 represented an engineering achievement that Germany couldn't match. The Sherman tank itself was unremarkable compared to German armor. The Panther and Tiger tanks had better guns, better armor, better range. But the Allies had produced 49,000 234 Sherman tanks by war's end. Germany produced 6,000 Panthers and 1,347 Tigers. The Sherman wasn't built to be better than a Tiger in single combat. It was built to be produced in such overwhelming numbers that Germany would face 10 Shermans for every Tiger, then 20, then 50, until the qualitative superiority of German engineering became irrelevant against the quantitative tsunami of Allied production. Behind the DD tanks came the first wave of infantry landing craft, each carrying a platoon of men who were about to experience what historians would call the longest day, but what the men themselves would call something far less poetic and far more accurate. Industrial warfare at its most concentrated and most lethal. The landing craft themselves were not sophisticated vessels. They were steel boxes with a ramp at the front and an engine at the back, built in the thousands by shipyards that had never built a military vessel before the war. The LCVP landing craft, vehicle, personnel had been designed by Andrew Higgins, a New Orleans boat builder, and refined into a vessel so simple, so robust, and so perfectly suited to its purpose that Eisenhower would later say that Higgins won the war for us. The LCVP could carry 36 men or a single vehicle. It drew less than 4 feet of water. It could be built in 8 weeks and cost $12,000. The Allies built 23,358 of them. Their design was so straightforward that crews could be trained in days. Their simplicity meant they rarely broke down. Their numbers meant that losses, and there would be substantial losses, were statistically acceptable because dozens more would arrive in the next wave, and the next, and the next, in a continuous conveyor belt of men and material that would not stop for weather, casualties, or German resistance. The German defenders of Fortress Europe had prepared for an invasion, but they had prepared for the wrong kind of invasion. They had built the Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, gun emplacements, beach obstacles, and minefields stretching from Norway to Spain, based on the assumption that they would face an enemy constrained by the same logistical and industrial limitations that governed German military planning. They had calculated that an invasion would require capturing a major port within days to sustain the attacking force. Therefore, they had fortified ports. They had assumed that Allied air power, while formidable, could be contested by the Luftwaffe, which still fielded modern aircraft and experienced pilots. Therefore, they had positioned fighter squadrons within range of the likely invasion points. They had prepared for an enemy who would have to choose between capturing territory quickly or building up supply depots slowly, because no attacking force could do both simultaneously. Every one of these assumptions was wrong, and the wrongness wasn't a failure of intelligence or tactics. It was a failure to understand that the enemy they faced had already won an entirely different war, an economic war whose outcome would determine this military conflict regardless of how well German soldiers fought. As the first landing craft hit the beach at 0630 hours, German machine gunners in bunkers like Pluskat's opened fire with MG-42 machine guns, superb weapons, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, fed by belts that could be changed in seconds by well-trained crews. These gunners were not the poorly trained conscripts of popular imagination. Many were hardened veterans transferred from the Eastern Front, men who had survived the incomprehensible meat grinder of the Soviet advance and who knew their business with grim efficiency. They cut down the first wave of American infantry with a slaughter so complete that the beach became choked with bodies. Entire companies were destroyed in minutes. The water turned red. Officers who had trained for years for this moment were killed within seconds of the ramp dropping. It was a massacre, and it was exactly what German planners had hoped, for a killing field where Allied soldiers would be destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Except they were replaced. Immediately, continuously, relentlessly. The second wave hit the beach before the first wave had even established a toehold. Then the third wave. Then the fourth. The landing craft that had just disgorged their human cargo turned around, sailed back to the transports, loaded up with another 36 men, and returned. This cycle repeated every 30 minutes for hours, then for days, then for weeks. The mathematics were brutal in both directions. German machine gunners could kill American soldiers faster than Americans could advance up the beach, but American industry could produce soldiers, equipment, ammunition, and supplies faster than Germans could kill them. This wasn't hyperbole. It was arithmetic. The United States had mobilized 16 million men for military service. They were training 100,000 new troops every month. They were producing 100,000 helmets, 300,000 pairs of boots, and 50,000 rifles every day. A German machine gunner who killed 100 Americans, an almost impossible individual achievement, would be immediately faced with 200 more, then 400 more, then 800 more. Fresh troops with fresh equipment arriving on fresh landing craft that had been built in Louisiana shipyards by workers who would build another landing craft tomorrow, and another the day after that. By 0800 hours, the beach that had been an abattoir 90 minutes earlier was beginning to transform into something else, a supply depot. Engineers were blowing gaps through the beach obstacles with Bangalore torpedoes, tubes of explosives, produced by the tens of thousands. Bulldozers, amphibious bulldozers, specifically designed for beach operations, were pushing aside the Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates that the Germans had laboriously emplaced to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. These bulldozers were being driven by drivers who, if killed, would be immediately replaced by another driver from the next wave. The bulldozers themselves, if destroyed, would be replaced by another bulldozer that was already loaded on a transport ship waiting its turn to beach. This wasn't because individual soldiers or machines were expendable in some callous sense. It was because the Allied logistical system had been designed with such systematic redundancy that the destruction of any individual component, man or machine, created no significant degradation in overall capability. The naval bombardment that accompanied these landings represented a concentration of firepower that had no historical precedent. The battleship USS Texas, positioned 3,000 yards offshore, was firing its 10 14-inch guns in deliberate sequence, each gun crew reloading, aiming, and firing independently to maintain a continuous rate of fire. A single 14-inch shell weighed 1,500 pounds. When it hit a German bunker, the bunker ceased to exist as a structure and became a crater containing steel fragments and human remains. The Texas fired 250 shells that morning, then continued firing for days. Its magazines held 1,100 shells, and when those ran low, ammunition ships would pull alongside and reload it while it continued operating. This process, the industrial-scale delivery of explosive force, was repeated by 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 105 destroyers, collectively firing tens of thousands of shells in a bombardment so sustained and so overwhelming that German survivors would later describe it not as artillery fire, but as an earthquake that never stopped. Major Pluskat, inside his bunker, felt each impact as a physical blow transmitted through the concrete. His command post had been built to withstand bombardment, but it had been built based on German calculations of what bombardment meant: sporadic artillery fire from guns limited by ammunition supply and barrel wear. The designers hadn't contemplated naval rifles with effectively unlimited ammunition firing for days. The concrete cracked. Dust filled the air. The telephone line to headquarters was cut by shell fire. Then the backup line. Then the radio antenna was blown away. Pluskat and his men were being systematically entombed in a structure that had been designed to protect them, cut off from communication, unable to affect the battle developing around them, reduced to witnesses of their own obsolescence. The bunker hadn't failed. The entire defensive strategy it embodied had failed because it was based on assumptions about warfare that were 5 years out of date. By noon, the Allied beachhead on Omaha, the most contested and most difficult of the 5 landing beaches, was 3 miles wide and perhaps a mile deep. It wasn't the rapid advance that planners had hoped for, but it was sufficient, and sufficient was all that mattered because the alternative was unthinkable. The Germans couldn't push the Allies back into the sea because they lacked the mobile reserves to mount a counterattack of sufficient strength. The 21st Panzer Division, the closest armored formation, had attempted to reach the beaches and been destroyed piecemeal by Allied fighter bombers before it could concentrate its forces. The 12th SS Panzer Division would need 2 days to reach Normandy from its position south of the Seine, and during those 2 days it would be under continuous air attack from Allied aircraft flying from England. These panzer divisions were formidable formations, but they were being asked to perform a task that was mathematically impossible. Defeat an enemy that could replace every casualty, every lost vehicle, every expended shell faster than the Germans could inflict those losses. The numbers that would emerge in the weeks following D-Day tell a story that contemporaries struggled to articulate, but that historians would later recognize as the clearest possible demonstration of industrial warfare's ultimate logic. In the first 24 hours after landing, the Allies put ashore 156,000 troops. By the end of Week 1, 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed across the 5 beaches. A month after D-Day, the Allies had landed 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies. Each of these figures represented not just military capability but industrial capacity. Every vehicle required steel, rubber, glass, electronics, petroleum for fuel, and a factory that could produce it. Every ton of supplies required mining, refining, manufacturing, packaging, transportation across an ocean, and delivery to a beach. Every soldier required feeding 3,000 calories per day, multiplied by 850,000 men, equals 2.55 billion calories per day, or 286,000 pounds of food daily, or 143 tons of food, plus water, plus medical supplies, plus ammunition, plus replacement uniforms, plus mail from home, plus the 1,000 other items that a modern industrial army required to remain functional. The German army defending Normandy in June 1944 numbered approximately 380,000 men, and it was starving. Not literally starving in the sense of imminent death from malnutrition, but starving in every logistical sense that mattered. It was starving for ammunition. German artillery was rationed to 15 shells per gun per day in some sectors because replacement shells couldn't be brought forward through roads that were under constant air attack. It was starving for fuel. Panzer divisions sat immobilized, not because their tanks were destroyed, but because there was no diesel to move them. It was starving for replacements. A German infantry division that took 30% casualties in combat would wait weeks or months for replacement troops because there were no replacements available. Germany was still training soldiers, still producing tanks, still manufacturing shells. But all of these activities were happening inside a collapsing economic system that was being systematically strangled by Allied bombing, Allied naval blockade, and the loss of resource-rich territories in the east. The Luftwaffe flew 319 sorties over Normandy on D-Day, 319 flights by individual aircraft against an Allied force of 14,674 sorties. This wasn't because German pilots lacked courage or skill. It was because the Luftwaffe no longer existed as a functional air force in Western Europe. It had been destroyed through attrition, worn down by years of fighting against opponents who could replace every lost aircraft twice over, while Germany struggled to maintain production rates. In 1943, Germany had produced 25,527 aircraft of all types: fighters, bombers, transports. The United States alone produced 85,898 aircraft that year. When you added British production of 26,263 aircraft, the Allies were outproducing Germany by a ratio of more than 4-1. And this was Germany's peak production year. By 1944, German factories were being bombed systematically. Skilled workers were being drafted to replace infantry losses in the east. Aluminum supplies were disrupted. Oil refineries were being destroyed. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, a genuine technological achievement that was superior to any Allied fighter, was being produced in underground factories at a rate of 60 per month, but couldn't be deployed in numbers that mattered because the pilots who could fly it were dead, and the fuel to power it was unavailable, and the airfields from which it could operate were cratered by bombing. By evening on June 6th, Major Pluskat had been relieved from his bunker by troops advancing inland from the beach. He and his surviving men retreated towards Sarn, joining the chaotic mass of German forces, attempting to establish a defensive line that could stop the Allied advance. That line would never fully form. German commanders requested reinforcements, and were told that no reinforcements existed. They requested air support, and watched the sky remain empty of German aircraft, while Allied fighter bombers prowled overhead with impunity. They requested ammunition resupply and were told that the supply columns had been destroyed by airstrikes before reaching the front. The most decorated, experienced, and technically proficient army Germany had ever fielded was being systematically demolished, not by being outfought, but by being outsupplied. They were losing an economic war while fighting a military battle, and there was no tactical brilliance or operational innovation that could compensate for that fundamental reality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B defending northern France, understood this with a clarity that apparently eluded many of his colleagues. He had requested Hitler's permission to move panzer reserves closer to the coast before the invasion, arguing that the first 24 hours would be decisive. Hitler had refused, insisting that the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais and that Normandy was a feint. This was a reasonable tactical assessment based on available intelligence, but it was also irrelevant. Even if every German panzer division had been positioned at Normandy, even if they had counterattacked immediately, even if they had thrown the Allies back into the sea on June 6th, the Allies would have returned on June 7th with more ships, more men, more tanks, more ammunition, and more air support. They would have returned on June 8th and June 9th, and every day thereafter until they succeeded, because they possessed the industrial capacity to absorb losses that would have crippled any previous military force in history. This wasn't speculation. The Allied Supreme Command had calculated acceptable casualty rates and determined that they could sustain up to 10,000 casualties per day for months if necessary, and still maintain offensive operations. Germany couldn't replace 10,000 casualties per week. The Battle of Normandy would continue for 77 days, ending in late August with the near-complete destruction of German forces in France. The Germans would lose 450,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They would lose 1,500 tanks, 3,500 artillery pieces, and 20,000 vehicles of all types. These losses were irreplaceable. The equipment couldn't be manufactured fast enough. The men couldn't be trained adequately. The fuel to power the vehicles didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Meanwhile, the Allies were landing an average of 65,000 tons of supplies per day through the artificial Mulberry harbors and through Cherbourg after its capture. They were building entire air bases in Normandy, not clearing existing French airfields, but bulldozing new ones from scratch, complete with fuel depots, ammunition bunkers, repair facilities, and control towers in a matter of days. They were laying pipelines under the English Channel to pump fuel directly from England to France, eliminating the need for tanker ships. They were constructing rail lines, paving roads, and establishing supply depots that functioned with the efficiency of peacetime logistics companies, because they were staffed by soldiers who had been logistics managers, railroad executives, and industrial planners in civilian life. The iconic photograph from D-Day, the one that would appear on magazine covers and in history books, shows American soldiers wading through surf toward Omaha Beach, their faces grim, their bodies hunched against incoming fire, the image capturing something essential about courage under fire. But that photograph, powerful as it is, obscures the larger truth of what happened that day. Those soldiers were brave, their courage was real, and their sacrifice was genuine. But they were also components in an industrial system, and the system was designed to spend them not callously, but systematically in the service of an objective that had been predetermined by economic factors years before the first landing craft touched sand. The question was never whether the Allies would win. The question was only how many resources they would need to expend to achieve victory, and the answer turned out to be fewer than they had available. In the months following Normandy, German generals would write extensively about the battle, analyzing tactical decisions, critiquing operational choices, debating whether different strategies might have yielded different outcomes. These analyses were professionally competent and historically interesting, but they shared a common blindness. They treated the Battle of Normandy as a military contest, decided by military factors. It wasn't. It was an economic contest that happened to be fought with military forces, and the outcome had been determined long before the first shot was fired. Germany had lost the war in 1942 when it failed to knock the Soviet Union out of the fight before American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. Everything after that point was denouement, a slow-motion collapse dressed up as a military conflict but actually driven by production figures, resource allocation tables, and industrial capacity measurements that rendered battlefield tactics increasingly irrelevant. Consider the arithmetic of shell production. In 1944, the United States produced 41 million artillery shells. Britain produced another 45 million. Combined Allied production, 86 million shells. Germany produced 54 million shells in 1944, its peak year. These numbers sound abstract until you translate them into battlefield reality. Allied artillery could fire at a rate that German gunners couldn't match without running out of ammunition. This meant that in any sustained artillery duel, Allied guns would systematically destroy German positions through sheer volume of fire. Individual German gun crews might be more accurate, more experienced, more tactically astute, and often were, but they would eventually be obliterated by an enemy who could afford to miss 9 times out of 10 and still win through sheer expenditure of shells. Or consider tank production. In the entire war, Germany produced approximately 67,000 armored fighting vehicles of all types: tanks, self-propelled guns, assault guns, tank destroyers. The United States alone produced 88,410 tanks. Add British and Soviet production, and the Allies produced roughly 230,000 armored vehicles. The qualitative superiority of late-war German armor was real. The Panther tank was arguably the best medium tank of the war, and the Tiger could destroy any Allied tank in a head-to-head engagement. But qualitative superiority became irrelevant when the quantitative disparity reached certain thresholds. A Tiger that could kill 10 Shermans before being destroyed was an impressive weapon. But if the Allies fielded 20 Shermans for every Tiger, the Tiger still lost. And the Allies weren't fielding 20 to 1. They were fielding 50 to 1 or 100 to 1, depending on the sector, because they could afford to lose tanks at ratios that would have been catastrophic for any pre-industrial military force. The petroleum mathematics were even more devastating. Germany produced 5.7 million metric tons of oil in 1944, mostly from synthetic fuel plants that were being bombed systematically by Allied strategic bombers. The United States produced 223 million metric tons that year. This meant that American Shermans, idling on a French roadside, waiting for orders, were consuming fuel that was more abundant than fuel available to German panzers attempting to reach the battle. Luftwaffe fighters sat grounded on airfields not because they were destroyed but because there were no fuel to fly them. U-boats remained in port because there was insufficient diesel to patrol. The entire German military machine was grinding to a halt, not from combat losses but from resource starvation, while Allied vehicles operated with such abundant fuel supplies that gasoline was being used to power generators, heat tents, and run movie projectors, showing Hollywood films to troops in rear areas. The ultimate expression of this economic warfare was the strategic bombing campaign that was destroying German cities while the Normandy battle raged. While Wehrmacht soldiers fought desperately to contain the beachhead, B-17 flying fortresses were bombing synthetic oil plants in Germany itself. On June 22, 1944, 16 days after D-Day, over 1,000 American bombers struck German oil infrastructure in a single day, dropping 2,897 tons of high explosives. This single raid required more explosive tonnage than the entire German Air Force dropped on Britain during the Blitz of 1940. The bombers that delivered these explosives had been built in factories that were producing one bomber every hour. The crews flying them had been trained in flight schools, graduating thousands of pilots annually. The bombs themselves had been manufactured in munitions plants, working 3 shifts around the clock. The fuel to fly the mission had been refined from oil pumped in Texas and Oklahoma, shipped across the Atlantic in tankers protected by destroyer escorts that had been laid down in shipyards that would produce another destroyer next month. Every element of this system was being sustained by an economy that was producing war materials while simultaneously producing civilian goods, maintaining living standards, and operating at full employment. Germany, by contrast, was being strangled. By late 1944, German industrial production was declining, not because factories were being bombed, though they were, but because raw materials couldn't reach the factories. Iron ore from Sweden was being interdicted by Allied submarines and bombers. Oil from Romania was being lost to the Soviet advance. Coal mines in the Ruhr were being bombed. Rail networks were being destroyed systematically, not because any single rail yard was irreplaceable, but because repairing them required resources that were needed elsewhere. The entire German economy had become a zero-sum game, where every ton of steel allocated to tank production was a ton not available for U-boat construction, and every barrel of fuel used to move troops was a barrel unavailable for aircraft, and every skilled worker building weapons was a worker not available to repair damaged infrastructure. Germany was being forced to make impossible choices between competing critical needs, while the Allies faced only logistical challenges of distribution, not scarcity. The psychological impact of this disparity was, if anything, more devastating than the material impact. German soldiers in Normandy reported feelings of helplessness and fatalism that had nothing to do with personal cowardice and everything to do with rational assessment of their situation. They knew that every radio they destroyed would be replaced immediately. Every Allied tank they knocked out would be followed by 2 more tomorrow. Every aircraft they shot down would be succeeded by 3 more the next day. They were fighting an opponent who could afford to make mistakes, absorb losses, and continue offensive operations without pause, while they themselves were operating on margins so thin that a single tactical error could be catastrophic because there were no reserves to correct it, no replacement equipment to restore combat capability, no strategic depth to fall back upon. German military doctrine had traditionally emphasized flexibility, initiative, and the ability of small units to operate independently and seize local advantages. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in Poland, France, and the early years of the Eastern Front. But it was designed for a military reality where both sides faced similar logistical constraints, and where tactical victories could be parlayed into operational successes that might achieve strategic objectives. By 1944, this entire framework had collapsed. Tactical victories, and the Wehrmacht still achieved them regularly, through superior training and experience, no longer translated into operational effects because the Allies could simply absorb the local defeat and continue operations elsewhere, or wait a day and renew the attack with fresh forces. The German tactical playbook, refined over decades of military study, had become a collection of techniques for winning battles that no longer mattered because the war was being decided by factors that existed outside the tactical sphere entirely. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a battle group in the 21st Panzer Division, would later write about the experience of counterattacking Allied positions near Caen in mid-June. His battle group, built around experienced troops who had fought in North Africa and Russia, executed a textbook flanking maneuver that temporarily recaptured several villages and destroyed a British tank squadron. It was, in purely military terms, a successful operation. It was also completely futile. The British absorbed the losses, rebuilt the squadron with replacement tanks and crews that arrived within 48 hours, and continued their offensive. Von Luck's battle group, meanwhile, had expended irreplaceable resources, fuel, ammunition, veteran soldiers on a tactical success that achieved nothing strategic and left them weaker than before the attack. He described it as attacking a rubber wall that absorbed every blow and then simply expanded back to its original position. This was the essential nature of the Normandy campaign and, by extension, of the entire latter half of World War II in Europe. The Allies were not particularly brilliant tactically. Eisenhower was a competent but not exceptional battlefield commander. Montgomery's plans were often overcautious. American infantry tactics in Bocage country were initially ineffective and costly. But none of these shortcomings mattered because the Allies possessed what might be called strategic invulnerability through resource abundance. They could afford to learn from mistakes because mistakes didn't compromise their ability to continue operations. They could pursue strategies that accepted high casualties because the casualties would be replaced. They could bomb targets with mediocre accuracy because they could afford to drop 10 times more bombs than necessary to ensure destruction. This wasn't elegance or efficiency. It was overwhelming force applied with the certainty that overwhelming force would eventually prevail regardless of how skillfully the enemy resisted. The cold mathematical logic of industrial warfare had one final, devastating corollary that Major Pluskat, watching the armada from his bunker that June morning, could not have articulated but certainly felt. Individual human factors, courage, training, experience, tactical skill, had been relegated to marginal variables in an equation dominated by industrial output. German soldiers in Normandy were, man for man, probably more experienced and better trained than their Allied counterparts. German equipment, weapon for weapon, was often superior. German tactical doctrine was sophisticated and flexible. None of this mattered. The Wehrmacht was being defeated by freight cars and assembly lines, and oil refineries and shipyards, by the accumulated economic weight of nations that had mobilized their entire industrial capacity for war and could sustain operations at Nolf, a tempo that Germany couldn't match. By August 1944, as German forces retreated from Normandy through the Falaise Gap, the evidence of this industrial superiority littered the Norman countryside. Thousands of destroyed German vehicles clogged every road, knocked out not primarily by superior Allied tanks, but by fighter bombers that prowled the skies with complete impunity, each aircraft carrying rockets and bombs that turned trucks, half-tracks, and even tanks into burning hulks. The Allies lost aircraft in these attacks, certainly, but the losses were acceptable because more aircraft would arrive tomorrow from England, flown by pilots who had received comprehensive training in aircraft that had been built last week in factories that would build more aircraft next week. The entire system was self-sustaining and self-reinforcing in a way that Germany could no longer match. The final toll of the Normandy campaign revealed the asymmetry with brutal clarity. The Allies had landed approximately 2.9 million men in France by the end of August, 1,944. They had suffered roughly 225,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. This was a horrific butcher's bill, representing immense human suffering and thousands of personal tragedies. It was also, in strategic terms, sustainable. The American, British, and Canadian armies absorbed these losses, rebuilt their divisions, and continued offensive operations without operational pause. Germany lost approximately 450,000 men, nearly twice the Allied casualties, and could not replace them. The Wehrmacht divisions that escaped the Falaise encirclement were divisions in name only, often reduced to a few hundred effectives with no heavy equipment, no transport, and no ability to reconstitute themselves as functional military formations. The German army that had invaded France in 1940 with such overwhelming success was being annihilated in 1944, defending the same territory, not because the soldiers of 1,944 were less capable than those of 1,940, but because the economic foundations supporting those soldiers had completely eroded. In October 1944, 4 months after D-Day, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff for the German Armed Forces High Command, prepared a memorandum for Hitler, assessing Germany's strategic situation. This document, later recovered by Allied investigators, is remarkable for its clinical precision and its fatalistic conclusions. Jodl calculated that Germany was producing approximately 1,200 tanks per month. Allied tank production was estimated at 5,000 per month. Germany was producing 2,500 aircraft monthly. Allied production exceeded 10,000. German oil production had fallen to 3 million tons annually due to bombing. Allied oil production exceeded 250 million tons annually. German steel production was 2 million tons per month. Combined Allied steel production was 7 million tons monthly. Jodl then performed a series of calculations projecting these ratios forward and concluded, in language that was carefully neutral but unmistakable in its implications, the arithmetic of this conflict no longer permits a German victory through military means. We are being defeated by production figures. The memorandum recommended immediate armistice negotiations before Germany's bargaining position deteriorated further. Hitler rejected this advice and ordered continued resistance, leading to 6 more months of war and hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. But Jodl's assessment was correct. The war had already been decided, not by battles but by spreadsheets, not by generals but by factory foremen, not by tactics but by the cold mathematics of industrial capacity. Major Werner Pluskat, standing in his bunker watching 7,000 ships materialize from the morning mist, had witnessed the physical manifestation of this truth. He had seen the future of warfare, a future where industrial economies transformed their productive capacity into military force, at scales that rendered traditional military virtues increasingly irrelevant. He had watched, in real time, as the concept of military victory was redefined from defeating the enemy's army to outproducing the enemy's economy until their army ceases to exist as a functional entity. The ships Pluskat saw were not merely transports or warships. They were symbols, physical representations of an economic reality that had been obscured by years of German military success. That reality was simple. Germany was a mid-sized industrial power attempting to conquer territory controlled by the combined industrial capacity of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. This was never a viable strategy. It had always been doomed by simple arithmetic. The Wehrmacht's victories in 1939 to 1941 had created the illusion that military skill could overcome industrial disparity, but this illusion was sustainable only as long as Germany faced enemies individually or enemies who hadn't yet fully mobilized their industrial base. By June 1944, that mobilization was complete, and the results were floating in the English Channel in numbers, so vast they resembled a geological phenomenon more than a human achievement. The story of D-Day, then, is not really a story about soldiers storming beaches, though that happened and was significant. It is not a story about tactical innovation or operational brilliance, though both existed. It is fundamentally a story about industrial warfare reaching its logical conclusion, the point where military outcomes are determined not by battlefield prowess, but by production capacity, resource availability, and logistical sustainability. It is the story of how war, in the industrial age, became an equation where variables like courage and tactical skill still mattered, but were increasingly overwhelmed by variables like steel production, oil refining capacity, and manufacturing output. The ships in the Channel, the aircraft overhead, the tanks rolling off the landing craft, all of these were not just military assets but proof statements in an argument about the nature of modern conflict. Major Pluskat survived the war and later provided his account of D-Day to historians, describing his emotions as he watched the invasion fleet appear. "I could not believe it," he said. "It was simply too much. Too many ships. I knew we would lose. I think I knew at that moment that Germany would lose the war. How could we fight this? How could anyone fight this?" His question was rhetorical but profound. The answer, of course, was that no one could fight it. Not because the Allied forces were invincible in any tactical sense, but because they represented a level of resource mobilization that exceeded anything Germany could match or counter. They were the physical embodiment of economies that had been completely restructured for war production, and those economies were now delivering the product of that restructuring onto a French beach with the inexorable force of an industrial process running at maximum efficiency. The lesson of D-Day, for military historians and strategic planners, was unambiguous. In industrial age warfare between peer competitors, victory goes not to the most tactically skilled or operationally innovative force, but to the force backed by superior industrial capacity and resource availability. This was not a comforting lesson, as it suggested that individual valor and tactical brilliance, the traditional virtues that militaries celebrated, had been relegated to secondary importance behind factors like GDP, manufacturing capacity, and resource extraction. But it was a lesson that has been reconfirmed repeatedly in every major conflict since 1944. Modern warfare, at the highest levels, is decided by logistics, production, and economics, long before soldiers engage in combat. The combat itself becomes simply the process by which this predetermined outcome manifests in physical reality. Werner Pluskat watched 7,000 ships and knew, with the certainty that comes from witnessing the impossible made real, that the invasion was unstoppable. He was right. But he was right for reasons that had nothing to do with the courage or capability of the men aboard those ships, and everything to do with the factories that built them, the oil refineries that fueled them, the assembly lines that equipped them, and the economic systems that sustained all of it. He was watching industrial capacity transformed into military force, and that transformation, once completed, was indeed unstoppable not through any mystical property of the machines themselves, but through the simple arithmetic of abundance versus scarcity, replacement versus attrition, systems designed to absorb losses versus systems that couldn't afford losses at all. In the end, Germany was not defeated by soldiers. It was buried under an avalanche of production, drowned in a tide of manufactured goods, and crushed beneath the weight of economies that could make war indefinitely, while Germany could only make war until its resources ran out. Those resources ran out in the summer of 1944, in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, beneath the wings of 11,000 aircraft and the guns of 7,000 ships, in a demonstration of industrial warfare's ultimate logic that remains, even 80 years later, both awe-inspiring and terrible in its implications.